Today we're going to be going through anarchism, and I just want to say that while I disagree with anarchists, they're still my comrades, and I hope they see me the same way too, especially after this video. I'm aware that a lot of my viewers are anarchists, so hopefully this doesn't upset them too much, but just remember that this is a discussion and not as much an attack on each other as it might be if we were dealing with right-wingers. Another thing, this may not be the most entertaining video in the world, so I apologise for that. I'm mainly just trying to get arguments across here. So, I don't know, to make up for this I'll do like a response video next or something, who knows. But for now, let's get into why I don't think anarchism works. So first and foremost, we need to cover what the state actually is. It's the main difference between Marxism and anarchism. Marxism, it's a very clear-cut one definition, that being a set of apparatus used by one class to enact its will against another. This apparatus includes things like the police force, the media, the army, the welfare state, and so on and so on. Anarchism, on the other hand, is a bit harder to pin down because they have like 50 different variants of their ideology, and then each variant of that has like 50 different fucking definitions of the state. So yeah, it's a little more difficult. So because of that, we're going to be going by what Libertarian Socialist Rants gave in his video, The Red Bureaucracy. So this may not be like specific to your own, if you're an anarchist watching, your own definition of the state, but it gives us somewhere to start this with. So
in this video, the word state will be used to refer to a combination of three individually necessary and jointly sufficient components. Firstly, a centralised institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Secondly, a clearly defined geographical area over which this violence is exercised. And thirdly, a centralised administrative governing body which lays claim to use of this violence.
He also goes on later to define something called the coordinator class, although we're going to be pretty much just ignoring this completely because he's trying to give a class based on someone's political relation to the state when class has only ever been economic relation to the means of production. So it's right. Now I know my first argument is going to seem a little cliche to anarchists, but do hear me out. I have points to back this up. I think that anarchism can actually work quite well on communal levels, localized to one city or maybe several cities across country. But I think the problem with this is that, as we see throughout history, regardless of what ideology it is, anarchism, Marxism, it will be crushed by external forces if it's only one commune or only a couple communes. It just doesn't stretch out to the entire nation. So, following that logic and following history, the only way we can really have successful revolutions, again, regardless of the ideology, is by going by a nationwide revolution. However, in order to have influence over an entire nation, especially when pitted against imperialism, you kind of need an army of some relevant size to actually defend yourself with. And this army, of course, has to be nationwide, and anarchism has never really attempted to do this. And I know, of course, there's the Black Army in Ukraine, but we're going to be talking about that later. Now, when a revolutionary movement forms, it must also form a military force. This force serves as a spearhead against the pre-existing state with the aid of the people to overthrow them and establish the new society. Of course though, again, regardless of any ideology, you need to spread your propaganda through the pre-existing army so that it, splits up and fights against itself, further weakening the bourgeois and further strengthening the revolution. And we can see through almost every successful nationwide revolution that's happened in history, this is one of the things they did. They got the army on their side. And when they didn't, for instance, in like Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, it just didn't work. Now, once the new state is established, the new nationwide military becomes whatever, falls under the name of what that initial revolutionary military force was called. And then any, so that would include the part of the pre-existing army that went revolutionary, and then any parts of the pre-existing army still resistant to the revolution can just be purged as they'd be the weaker force from there. Now, this new army is probably going to have to be centralized. This is because every army in the 20th century up to modern day has been centralized. So that's what that's what every imperialist army you're going to be up against is going to be centralized. And you can insert varying degrees of democracy on the external control of it, but it at the end of the day it's still centralized. And it's safe to assume that if there was any tactical advantage to decentralizing an army on a large scale, a national-wide army, then it would have already been done by the pre-existing imperialist powers, right? So then to not centralize our own armies in a revolution would just be suicide. So in order to actually, maintain and control a centralized army, surely this requires some form of state apparatus or monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, that being, the Marxist and anarchist definition of the state. To extend from here, I also want to talk about conscription. And really, to get conscription implemented, you need, again, a state by our Marxist and anarchist definitions. And the reason you need conscription is so you can quickly build up an army of decent size to defend against imperialism. Had the Red Army, for example, not engaged in conscription, then after having their resources completely exhausted through not only a revolution but also a world war, they would have quickly succumbed to not just the provisional government again and then having their new government aided by the capitalists and all of that. No, it would have been much worse. They would have had the White Army just kind of waltz in there and set up a military dictatorship. I mean, call Stalin evil all you want, but looking at the guy who probably would have replaced him, I guess you could say he made Stalin look like an anarchist. Now, that's not to say conscription is going to be needed in every single revolution. It depends on the varying situation and conditions of the time. But the option must be left open should the conditions call for it. Lest the revolution fall back to the capitalist counter-revolutionaries or the outright fascists. This is partly why a state is required, to call upon the people to defend their country if they need to. And I know conscription is really shitty, but we can't really be too liberal here. I mean, if the capitalists aren't going to hold back. So you kind of have to take everything that you can in order to build socialism. Which sucks, but yeah. Now going back to centralization for a minute, the only reason the Black Army was not centralized, and I know some of you are rushing to the comments to tell me how effective they were while being decentralized right now, was because of their size and the area under which they had influence. Now, the size of the Black Army peaked at about 30,000, in their prime. And they only really ever stayed in one section of Ukraine. If we compare that to like the Red Army or the White Army, they numbered in the millions and they were spread over both Ukraine and Russia. To go on from this, the Black Army didn't even supply its own weapons. And the reason that the Black Army could be so effective at attacking the White Army from behind with guerrilla tactics is because the Red Army was occupying the front. Basically what I'm saying here is that the Black Army was only ever a guerrilla force extension to the Red Army, and they would have been useless without them. Now, you may be thinking that it was just bad luck or circumstance that had the Free Territory in the situation it was, and that, with the low manpower and inability to really fight back against its enemies, or like the Red Army when they turned on them, and that had we just repeated the same working society, except with a bigger functioning army, then it would have worked and would have been fine, right? Well, ignoring the fact that the Black Army's method of organisation for their army probably wouldn't have held at all when they actually got to a relevant size to really hold their own, and ignoring the fact that in order to really muster up that manpower, you would probably have needed conscription again, which would have required a state, it turns out the society itself was kind of a mess as well. Now, the main points of this claim includes things like Makhno had no real plans to industrialize Ukraine. In fact, he considered cities to be a poison, and he never really wanted the peasants and the workers to work to collaborate, but instead negotiate. He also essentially formed his own state, regulating the press, redistributed land according to specific laws that his own Black Army made. He had his own militia, of course, which had a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, and then, of course, the state apparatus. So again, by both Marxist and anarchist sense, it's a state. And then, of course, he even introduced his own monetary policy to the entirety of the country, although I don't really know if you can call it monetary policy. It was literally introducing his own currency, which said, feel free to forge this, printed on the thing. And then he validated all other currencies in the country, even ones that belong to governments that no longer existed anymore. This caused massive inflation for Ukraine and just decimated workers' wages. And of course, peasants didn't really mind because they could just grow their own food, but workers kind of relied, for their food to come from their wages, so they kind of got fucked. What's worse is that then Makhno refused to try and help to fix the workers or try and fix the problems that he had put them in. He didn't really care. And we can see an example of this again where he refused to pay railroad workers when they hadn't been paid in months because he said the Black Army didn't use the railroad, therefore it wasn't his problem and they should ask someone who did have to use the railroad. By the way, the Black Army did have to use the railroad. There were an army stretching out across half a country, but whatever. It just shows how he didn't really care about the living standards of the people under his influence, and he had no interest in industrializing or making Ukraine just simply a better standard of a society and improving it. Because again, he wasn't even willing to pay the railroads to function properly. Honestly, it gets so much more worse than this, and it's probably enough content that I could fill the rest of this video with it. But instead, I'm going to link an article in the description for you guys to read. It's got sources for all of its claims. I would really consider giving this a read, because not only does it go over the Black Army and Makhno and Ukraine and stuff, but it also goes over the conditions of Russia at the time, and talks a little about, as I was talking about earlier, why they needed conscription, and some really interesting stuff there, so I checked that out. But really, the reason it's so important to highlight this to anarchists is because they make the claim that the Free Territory of Ukraine was this perfectly functioning anarchist utopia, when in actuality it really wasn't. And then they also make the further claim that the methods of governments that was being used there should have been extended to all of Russia instead of the evil Stalinism that we got instead, which again is just absolutely ridiculous. Look, please, if you're an anarchist, I implore you to read this article. This isn't to try and refute the inner workings of anarchism in itself. It's really just showing the one example where you can give where it hasn't been a communal, small-scale thing, wasn't even a functioning society. Honestly, as I did my research into the Free Territory of Ukraine, I kind of regretted putting them in my Socialism Never Worked video, although to be honest, I guess it's not that bad because, it was just meant for, normal person propaganda anyway, so that's fine, but still, I'm just trying to stress how bad, these guys are. Anyway, so let's get on to some different points here. Anarchism intends to attain socialism and then have functioning and maintain socialism without the use of the state at any process. But I don't really think they can do this, unless they change the definition of the state just before they make that state. Now, the primary example I want to give for this is the use of militias. Now, in a letter that Lenin wrote while he was exiled from Russia, he talks about the use of the people's militias and says that forming them would be one of the first steps in establishing the proletarian state. Now, he gives an example while stressing that any example that he gives on paper would never be as good as real direct action taken by the workers there and then, but it's just to give an idea. Now, he says if you get half the population of St. Petersburg at the time, which was about 1 million, and then take away a generous 250,000 of that to accommodate for the physically unable and elderly, and you only and all of these people joined the militia, then you would only need one person to work once every 15 days to have a fighting force of 50,000 men on any given day within that city. This is the people's militia, and this is one of the first steps in establishing the proletarian state apparatus. My argument here is that surely anarchists advocate for the use of people militias as well, but surely they are forms of state. I mean, by the Marxist definition, they are state apparatus because they're used to impose one class's will against another, but even by the anarchist definition, they're a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. If they weren't, then they would just be useless, because it's like, oh yeah, well, we're allowed to use violence against you, but you're allowed to use violence against us, and that's okay, and you don't actually have to listen to what we say, and no, that just doesn't work. Now, this is where the idea that anarchists want to make a state without calling it a state comes from. Even if it's 100% voluntary and completely democratic, it's still a militia, and therefore it's still a part of state apparatus, and it's very much required in any functioning society. Now, most of the time when there are debates between Marxists and anarchists, it's usually about the revolutionary method or the transitional period, but there seems to be something, in my opinion, that anarchists are just missing out from the actual workings of a socialist economy itself. In Marx's critique of the Gotha program, he lays down the fundamental ideas to the workings of a socialist economy, or lower phase communism. He says that from the proceeds of labour of a factory, deductions have to be made. Here's a direct quote. First, cover for replacement of the means of production used up. Second, additional portion for expansion of production. Third, reserve of insurance funds to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, etc. He then goes further to say, before this is divided among the individuals, by which he means the proceeds of labour, this has to be deducted again. From it, first, the general cost of administration not belonging to production. This part will, from the outset, be very considerably restricted in comparison with present-day society, and it diminishes in proportion as the new society develops. Second, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc. From the outset, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops. Third, funds for those unable to work, etc. In short, what is included under so-called official poor relief today. What this essentially means is that there needs to be value taken out of the proceeds of labour to be reinvested back into the workplace, as well as the rest of society to cover things like healthcare, schooling, and all of that stuff. I would assume that this form of society is also what anarchists would advocate for, but surely in order for this to work, there needs to be some form of state apparatus mediating the process. Now, as Marx explains in the Critique of the Gotha Programme, there would still be small amounts of wealth inequality in a low form of communism. This is because if you're paying people based on labour, different people can do different amounts of labour due to physical or mental differences, or because of circumstances like one man is married and another is not. This simply means that some people are going to have more labour vouchers given to them than others. So this also means because there's also not resource abundance yet, they're going to be able to get more luxury resources which aren't provided for their basic needs. This means that the workers very much have an incentive to make sure that their labour does not get deducted for the use of to go back into society, so then they themselves can buy more luxuries. This would mean you'd need some form of state apparatus to make sure that this isn't happening. Essentially think of it like taxes today. So this would be a form of state apparatus, and at the same time it would have to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, because if there are any workers that ever refuse to cooperate, then force would have to be used against them. Now, of course, this state apparatus would cease to exist when resource abundance comes about, but you can't have working socialism without some form of state apparatus, but anarchists seem to think you can. It would seem that unless anarchists advocate for some weird form of mutualism, they are forced to accept the necessity of the state apparatus. This including the revolutionary and transitional phases with the People's Militia, as well as the functioning socialist society that deals with resource allocation and labour voucher distribution. So then, from here I kind of go on to ask, what exactly are the differences between anarchists and Marxists? Now hear me out for a second here. If I'm being completely honest, to me it seems like a lot of anarchists are just afraid of the connotations that come with Marxism, assuming that it means automatically some big scary typical hierarchical state, which by the way isn't how it works at all, but that's not for this video, and automatically just conflate it with Stalinism essentially. And I also see a lot of the time the arguments thrown that Marxism has been tried loads of times, always results in dictatorship, blah blah blah. Shit I'd expect to hear from liberals, if I'm quite honest. And look, while there are flavours of Marxism that do advocate for all the scary tanky stuff that no one really likes apart from, the tankies, that doesn't mean you have to, agree with them. You can just not associate with those guys. So what I really want to do now is give just a very quick simplified core list of a loosely defined libertarian Marxist society. So first off, we have decentralized democratic worker councils across the entire country that represent individual industries with one centralized organization with the sole purpose of combating against imperialism. Secondly is the use of state apparatus in the forms such as local militias run by the people. And lastly is the use of state apparatus to deal with labor voucher allocation and resource distribution and all of that stuff. So if we look back at anarchism, we already see how the use of a people's militia is a state in itself. And we also see that for post-revolutionary socialism, again, we need to make use of some kind of state apparatus. And as far as I know, most types of anarchism also advocate for decentralized democratic worker councils. Now, I will make it clear that I am really referring to just the very typical standard anarchist. I do get that because there are so many variations, not every anarchist is going to agree with the core points that I've given, but I do feel like this is probably the most general definition I can give. So in my eyes, the only real difference that there seems to be between anarchism and libertarian Marxism is that the latter has a consistent definition for the state. So why not just identify as libertarian Marxists? Even if I'm completely off here, you can see my thought process, can't you? Anyways guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. It was a lot of fun to make this. I hope all the anarchists don't hate me forever now, but hopefully I haven't been too mean to you guys either. Hopefully I haven't shattered anyone's dreams about the glory that was Ukraine or anything, but we'll see. But yeah, thanks for watching guys.